Hi, everybody. Welcome to my class in Losing It, a mini workshop for the In Your Right Mind group. Summer 2022 is when I'm recording this, days before the residency begins for us full-time teachers. Uh, so I'm in the thick of the preps for the residency. And if you're a former student of Seton Hill, then you know how busy I really am. Um, if not, assume I am an example of the title of today's workshop, Losing It. I am losing it, quite busy right now. So I'm going to get right to it, and we're going to have a good time talking about some ideas to keep in mind when dealing with characters that are experiencing extreme duress psychologically. Maybe they're at their breaking point or have just broken their brains. Um, and this is not just a topic, at least in my mind, for horror and thriller writers, though that is predominantly the audience for today's class. I'm going to be drawing a lot of my ideas for today's class from a workshop I gave at the Tim Wagner Writing in the Dark series of lessons um, last spring. Which is targeted primarily at horror writers. But to me, characters can lose their minds in any story, and sometimes extreme emotional situations when characters are perhaps just passionately in love. They might also be experiencing something akin to madness. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. I do have a slideshow for you, but I just wanted to preface this by saying that, as usually is the case with my talks, I'm more interested in the theory behind it so that you can maybe have a higher awareness of why things are done the way they're done in fiction, as well as how you might go about doing it. So we're going to talk about psychology in fiction today, um, particularly as it relates to characters experiencing a dramatic moment in a loaded psychological way. We will do this by analyzing a few passages of text I've got for you. I'm going to end with some exercises that you can take away from this and do on your own. I'm not going to say write right now or anything like that, because this is a pre-recorded class, unfortunately. So it may be shorter than some of the other ones, but I do hope you'll do some of the activities on your own afterwards, and that you'll leave this class with a greater sense of awareness about how you might approach these issues, both strategically in a way that will titillate your audience, but also empathetically, so that people will be able to identify with and maybe care for characters and others in real world who are experiencing psychological issues. Okay, let's see what we can do here. I'm going to split my screen and try to keep my face on one side and the slideshow on the other. Let's see how this works. Might be all right. You might get tired of seeing my face, but we'll see. So here we go. All right. Today's class is losing it. And, you might think about what that phrase literally accomplishes when we use that. Why do we say we're losing it if we're experiencing perhaps a nervous breakdown, or we're so stressed we feel like we're losing our minds? What does that mean to lose our minds? I hope you're answering silently to yourself. Well, let's just start with the premise that the phrase losing it is a loaded one because it assumes that you have it to begin with. In other words, that you have control over your own mind. And psychologists will tell you that we do keep our minds balanced when we're sane, but there's a constant juggling that's going on in our minds between desires and what society demands of us, our own perception of who we are and what we want and what we should do, what's prim and proper. And often, a lot of our desires and things are repressed during the day so that we can act as civilized, upstanding individuals. But that would imply that, when we dream, we lose it. And perhaps that means the mind needs to lose it once in a while. It needs to be lost. I'm already losing it. Let's begin. So if you don't know who I am, these are some of my books. A number of them are from Raw Dog Screaming Press, who will be at the book fair at the In Your Right Mind conference. But you should look them up online. Or you can go to my website, gorlitz.com, to learn more about me. These are just some of my old books. I'm working on all sorts of new and crazy things right now. But I am predominantly interested in psychological horror as opposed to ghosts and goblins, though I like to write about those things too. Being one. That's right, I'm a goblin ghost. No, I don't know. I teach at Seton Hill University's MFA in Writing Popular Fiction. I've been doing so since 1999, which, if you do the math, is as many years as it is in the 21st century, is how long I've been teaching there. A long time. It's a great program, so if you are not a former student of our MFA program, I hope you'll check it out and consider it. A lot of our students go on to publish. Some get teaching positions, and nearly all of them leave with a great sense of connection to other writers. That is something that's precious, and that's why there even is an In Your Right Mind conference. It's a regathering of folks who had to depart from something very special and want it to continue, and it does. So, back to the topic. Norman Bates once said, if you don't know who Norman Bates is, he was the main character in the film and book Psycho. That's a Hitchcock film or a Robert Bloch novel. Psycho, which is so important in the horror genre because, in my way of thinking anyway, ever since that was published, horror began to took a turn towards psychological issues and looking at the monsters of the id, so to speak, the madmen, the evil that man does, so that the demonic forces were no longer just occult demons or ghost goblins, but your fellow man. And it's always centered in the fact that we can only know so much about what another person is thinking. There's sort of that existential block. You can't really read another person's mind. You might be able to identify with what a person's going through, but you can never really know what they're thinking. That's why writing's great. Writing is a way to have access to another person's thoughts in an interesting way. Reading and writing. But Norman Bates has a moment in the film Psycho where he's talking to Marion Crane, who just committed a crime, and they're having lunch together, and she's feeling very, very guilty about stealing money from her boss, and he says this line to her. She says, "I must be mad," or something like that, and he says, "Well, we all go a little mad sometimes, don't you?" And there's this universal element to madness. We all lose it. We all lose it. And I wanted to start with that point because often in fiction, particularly 20th century literature and film, craziness is treated as an other. In other words, if someone has psychological issues, they are represented and demonized. They're treated as if they were monsters. And there's a problem with that because we all do go a little mad sometimes. We all can identify with the madman. We lose it. And like I suggested earlier, it could just be when we're dreaming, right? We're all a little crazy when we dream. We really are, because dreams are crazy. But the brain needs that release. And that's what's being staged. A waking daydream, quite often in fiction. Another notion that speaks to the universality of this topic is, this phrase that gets said an awful lot. Uh, in a world gone mad, right? Like everybody's crazy. Uh, there's even a Michael Bolton song, I think. Or, is it Michael Bolton? I don't know. It's crazy that I know that. Anyway, we all go a little mad, and the world itself is crazy. Uh, which to me, I interpret that as meaning that there is no perfection. There is no perfect sanity. And perhaps even there's a degree to which the concept of sanity is a myth, something we might strive towards. We might construct our whole lives to move towards psychological balance and to feel wholeness and to have mental wellness and all those things, to be healthy, I suppose, psychologically. But how do you know when you're in your ultimate ideal state? It's like saying, is there a way to be perfectly strong? No, you can always be stronger and stronger. That's why bodybuilders get these obscenely crazy bodies, because they keep pursuing it. It can be better. You can do more. And I think that's true of our minds too. Psychologically, we could be healthier. Um, and by and there is no perfect mental health, I guess is what I'm saying. And by the same token, all of us are imperfect psychologically. Like that's part of what it means to be human. Okay, so stories that focus primarily on madness, on psycho killers, crazy characters, or even just characters that might have some sort of breakage, let's say, or imbalance. For example, an autistic lead character. All right. I am not trying to demonize or other autism. I'm suggesting that that character actually represents a universal, let's say, frailty that we all have. Um, so we all are a little autistic, you see. Just like we all might be a little bit crazy, which is a bad word in psychology. You don't say crazy at all. Well, that's kind of a common speech phrase. Everybody's crazy. Um, Psychologists don't like to use that word. And you can imagine why, because it suggests that you're innately wrong and different than the rest of the world. You're not sane. But there are degrees of sanity, just the point I'm trying to make. Of course, the extremely deranged characters like the Joker in Batman, it's interesting. It's an archetype, right? The sort of clown or fool character gone awry. And it's important to realize that when we watch movies like Joker, which is one of the best-selling R-rated films of all time, it's very extreme and enlightening, I think, about what causes characters to act the way they do, what motivates them to behave the way that they do. And often it's because they have some need that's unfulfilled in everyday life and society. So they come at it, they need to fulfill this need. So that sounded circular to me, but they're driven to fulfill a need in a way that is not normative. Okay, it's not normal. And horror writers especially, but also thriller writers, any writer that has a really badass villain who's weird, like perhaps the Joker, has a twisted mind, right, is obsessive or deranged. Often they go too far. They violate social norms in order to get what they want. And that's what a crime is. So it's not always about murder. But murder is the most obvious violation of a social norm, and it's something that affects us all. We both fear some deranged killer just going postal, as they say, but also that's kind of what's interesting about these characters is that there's a pathology that we like to follow when we read about them. So TV shows like Criminal Minds are very popular for this very reason. Sometimes I think I'm speaking the obvious, but you know, you got to put it all on the table and think about like, oh yeah, why do we like characters like this? What's fascinating about them? Why is this a marketable genre? Uh, Crazy stuff. Well, you know, it's not just these dark stories either. As I suggested before, you know, passion is also a kind of madness. So if you're a romance author, and you're not just writing a serial killer romance or something crazy like that, I'm sorry, I keep using the word crazy today, um, then, you know, any moment in your story where a character just falls in love is a kind of falling in the state of madness. Here's a great quote from Shakespeare. It's from the play As You Like It. I'll read it out loud. Love is merely a madness. And I tell you, deserves as well a dark house and a whip as madmen do. In other words, it deserves to be punished and banished. And the reason why they are not so punished and cured is that the lunacy is so ordinary that the whippers are in love too. So it's like the mad punishing the mad, and they don't do that. And that sounds so sadistic, almost like in a fetishistic way. The whippers are in love too. Oh, this quote could inspire a great like erotic romance. No. You know, there's a word in this quote that I jumped out at me. Lunacy. Lunacy. I bet you've heard of that before. Lunatics. You know, right now I have the Pink Floyd song in my mind. The lunatic is on the grass. You know that one? Right, the dark side of the moon. Lunacy is literally a reference to the moon, lunar, right? So a lunatic is someone who is like affected by the moon. And you might be thinking of a werewolf. Yeah, a werewolf is a metaphor for a person who's gone mad with, you know, animalistic urges. It's literally a wolf man. It's an animal man. And psychologically, right, the wolf is the id of the character, the unconscious mind that desires to, it has lusts, it has need to feed and all that. And it's very much about the body. And, you know, there's a degree to which romance is kind of about paranormal romance plays with this all over the place, right? Say no more, Arnzen. Okay, and in horror, it's pretty obvious too. I mean, it's damn obvious, but I wanted to read to you this quotation from Tim Wagner from his book, Writing in the Dark, published by Raw Dog Screaming Press, I think in 2021, where he talks about a whole side of the genre that I mentioned earlier in reference to Hitchcock's Psycho, and that is psychological horror or psychothrillers. Right, here's how he defines this genre. And if you can't tell, I'm just kind of pointing at where lunacy finds itself in genres. Okay, so obviously there's medical thrillers where there might be like a psychologist is the main character, and it's like the science of the mind is predominant. But in many cases, psychological horror is about what Tim Wagner mentions here, distorted reality. Okay, for Wagner, horror is a distortion of reality that's frightening. Okay, so the subgenre of psychological horror, he says, I'll read it out loud to you, is when the monstrous distortion occurs in someone's mental makeup. So somebody's mind is distorted. Probably the most well-known character in this genre is dun, 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 Norman Bates from Psycho. The narrator in Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart fits into this category as well, and I'm going to show you an excerpt from that in a minute. This subgenre can, and often does, overlap with the thriller genre. They're virtually identical. But psychological horror focuses on a greater degree of distortion in a character's psyche. So it's almost the main point. To the point where they become a monster in their thought processes and behaviors. Okay. And I just wanted a little sidebar there. Thrillers are often focused on the victim of some situation, like if there's a serial killer chasing someone, I don't know, I have Texas Chainsaw Massacre in my mind. It's about people in peril. Thrillers are about people in peril and suffering. They're kind of Job narratives, if you know your Bible. And we root for them to survive. That's what is at the heart of many thrillers. But Wagner is saying that psychological horror is a little more interested in the villain. That is what motivates Leatherface to chase the woman with his chainsaw. What's going on in his brain? The monsters that are mental monsters. So the focus shifts to that in psychological horror. Even though there are thriller elements, there are victims, people in peril, and all that. But the reader is really interested in the psychology of the madman or the villain. And again, to the point where they become a monster in their thought process. Writing psychological horror allows you to put surprising revelations and twists into your story because you can employ unreliable narrators, and we'll talk about that in a minute, or characters who can be erratic and unpredictable. Totally true. All right, and that could be just in a scene. That's why I'm saying to you that this isn't just limited to horror fiction. There can be moments of psychological horror in different genres where characters act erratically or unpredictably. Maybe they're drunk or passionately in love or obsessive. Wagner gives the example of Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl as an excellent example of an unreliable narrator in a story. That's, spoiler alert on that one. If you're writing in this subgenre, be careful to avoid overused tropes such as the misogynistic serial killer or the character who believes other people are demons who must be killed. Strive for originality. And then he adds this caveat that I can't echo often enough. Keep in mind that in real life, if that's a thing, the vast majority of people who suffer from mental illness are not dangerous to others. Okay? And you should avoid portraying mental illness in and of itself as always being a monstrous distortion. Make it clear that your psychologically disturbed homicidal characters are the exception rather than the rule. They should be extremely different than most people. They should be almost absurdly insane, off their rocker, that they really, really lost it, and they commit atrocities that most people wouldn't. And perhaps they have a twisted logic. To me, that's one of the thrills of writing this stuff, is to kind of show readers that there is a logic, a pathology to madness, and so that the reader can identify with it and go, oh yeah, you know what, I could see someone thinking that way, even though that's absurd, crazy, one should never do that, it's immoral, or whatever the word might be. But you don't want to demonize all people who have mental illnesses either as being crazy, demonic, distorted people. A lot of people manage their psychological issues, problems. It's not necessarily a deep illness all the time. And for those who do suffer deeply from these things, let's say somebody who has anxiety attacks often, or deep, deep depression, they often can be helped. They can manage it. And they're not, going to go get a chainsaw and kill everybody at the local Walmart on Sunday. I mean, that's an extreme representation of this issue. In other words, the word crazy is not something that applies to people at all. That's a label that we sometimes say, you're crazy, or he's crazy, that person was crazy, or insane, or fill in the blank with any other synonym for that, okay? But the truth is, What we really mean is craziness is a behavior. Okay, it's temporary usually, uh, or it's contingent on certain factors to be in place that that are triggered. Okay, um, so the more you know about psychology, the more you can read about it, study the human mind, take classes in psychology, uh, read Psychology Today online. Uh, the better off you'll be as a writer, I think, because you'll understand the human mind. And characters are really behaving, engines of behavior. And sometimes they don't behave properly. And that would be what we call acting crazy. So it's a behavior. And all behaviors are simply a response to a stimulus of some kind, right? It's construed as threatening craziness because if someone has lost their mind, is off their rocker, don't know what it means to be on your rocker. That itself could be crazy, but whatever. Uh, it's that response to a stimulus. Someone responds or behaves in a way that's threatening, or a reader might believe that to be threatening, because it is behavior that is unexpected, illogical, chaotic, uncontrollable, right? Or it's like expressing thoughts, beliefs, ideas, uh, and committing actions that are unrealistic, like saying, yeah, I could walk on water, right? You're crazy. You think you're Jesus Christ, right? That kind of thing. Sometimes this kind of behavior is habitually patterned. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the TV show Monk, but you might remember that the main character is a detective who's really, really smart, but he has OCD. So like he's always like he's a germaphobe. He always has to clean things when he goes to the crime scene. It's like he's dusting the shelf when there's a dead body on the floor, that kind of thing. It's kind of funny, but it's a good representation of this, what I mean by habitual pattern behavior. Uh, Sometimes it's the opposite of that. It's not predictable at all. It's an instant eruption of emotion rather than a considered, thoughtful act, right? Don't act crazy. Can you imagine somebody saying that? And then finally, this behavior that I'm talking about, that I want you to think about, it's contrary to an emotional norm. So somebody could be like angry in a situation where everybody else would be peaceful, mellow. One person's angry, maybe they're acting crazy, right? You see? And how does this help you in your fiction? Well, I mean, think about all the scenarios that you come up with, all the premises you write about. There often will be characters that are going kind of against the norm, against the grain, behaving in some of these unexpected, chaotic, unrealistic, habitual ways. And those moments call attention to themselves, right? Um, Readers start to pay attention and think, what's going on with that character? They seem to be obsessively doing this thing. Have we gone over Psychology 101 enough? Do you know enough about the basics? Well, what can I tell you, right? So earlier I suggested that a lot of what motivates us is our desires that are unfulfilled. So they come out in everyday life in a crazy way. The mind will get what it wants, either through dreaming or through aberrant behavior. That's because our unconscious mind is like a human animal. It's always questing after food, sexual desires to mate and all that. This is Freudian psychology, right? And that this unconscious mind really motivates everything we do. But our civilized world, our civilized self is trained to keep those unconscious wishes at bay and to be prim and proper rather than animalistic. That act is called repression, and those repressed desires come out in weird ways sometimes. That's what a Freudian slip is. It's a kind of return of the repressed. It's something that happens. those unconscious things leak out. Um, and fiction participates in this, okay? Fiction is kind of a waking daydream, just like an actual dream might allow us to experience our wishes, right? We might want to be rich and famous, so we dream about that at night, or we read about it in fiction. So if you write fantasy, you write tales of wish fulfillment. And that word fantasy, geez, I mean, I know it's a genre, but it's also all over, the interpretation of dreams by Freud. I've already talked about monsters of the id. These are kind of like representations of our libidinous desires, our taboo desires. Um, so every monster is kind of is a embodiment of those desires. All right, just even think of Godzilla or something like that, just terrorizing Tokyo. Like, what is it after? Right? Sometimes people just like want to destroy the world. We wish the world was different, and those giant kaiju acts of destruction. Those are metaphors for that desire. So, monsters of the id is a phrase that critics use for that. I also would use the phrase nightmares of the superego. Superego isn't some like Avengers type superhero self. It's the superego is that part of ourselves that's defined by the world. The world is superior to us. It surrounds us, and so we are like fish in an aquarium or a sea of society, and society's constantly like streaming its currents into us. So, our church, our parents, our friends, television, movies, the stories we read, all these things come at us from the world, and we kind of introject them. We make them a part of ourselves. And then sometimes we play act them back out. We project those things back out. So, our psyches are kind of like sponges. We only see the tip of the iceberg of our conscious mind. There's this whole unconscious mind that's underwater, so to speak, metaphorically. But there's also the notion that we are immersed in society as much as in our desires. And these forces are always competing. And sometimes fiction dramatizes that competition. That's what a conflict really is. It's like every story to a degree is a psychodrama. You could always analyze a story and psychoanalyze the character and say like this battle represents their inner struggle for wholeness or something like that. This is almost literary criticism at that point, but as a writer, you want to think about this stuff. Like, what is the psychodrama that you're constructing here? In fiction, we see characters who are obsessive, neurotic, and a neurosis is like being fixated on something, right? It's like you're caught in some almost childish state of want. It's something you never got as a kid, so you still want it as an adult. You're fixated on it. Maybe you fetishize it, right? Which is to excessively attach pleasure to something that isn't necessarily commonly associated with pleasure or needed for pleasure. And I know that a lot of you, because I know you, are immediately thinking of dirty things like bondage or whatever. But we live in a world of commodities, and those are our fetishes as well. So sometimes, just somebody who compulsively eats crackers is doing the same thing as someone who fetishizes, I don't know, feathers or something like that. Oh boy, don't get me started, folks. I'm going to obsessively compulsively drink my coffee. And in horror fiction, we often see haunting a lot, and that's usually a manifestation of guilt, like some dark cloud that lingers over someone. A ghost usually represents some kind of guilt, as well as what it represents on the surface. Think about all those stories with revenants in them, where like even just Scooby-Doo or something like that. But Ghosts possess places until a just act has been performed. And then they're released. They like go back to the vapor or something like that. They join the, who knows, the heavens. Um, and that's a manifestation of a crime, of a hang-up, literally. Let's just put it that way. A hang-up. A ghost is always a hang-up. Right? They linger. They hang around. And that means that the characters that are interacting with the ghosts, in a way, aren't letting them go. And the whole story is a narrative of that letting go. All right. And then probably most pertinent to what we're talking about today, chaos is a part of when the mind is no longer there is no more control over thoughts. That's a psychotic break where your conscious mind just gives up and your unconscious mind takes over. And I mean, in my mind, and I don't mean to demonize people who have this, to me, like a psychotic is a schizophrenic, somebody who's talking to the moon, right? Maybe you've seen people like this before. I always associate it with like Tourette's, even though that's not necessarily what it is. But people who can't control their speech, and almost like robotically, they start cursing and saying crazy things, and they twitch and they have a tick. It's like their body is mechanically producing this. Their brain as well is chemically imbalanced, and therefore it's like a machine that's broken, and it's like a record that's skipping or something. Now these metaphors, broken, they sound like it's a permanent problem, and I want to be very careful. I'm not saying that these people who suffer from these things are somehow bad people, evil, psychotic, like killers or anything like that. But in fiction, we often see this, and there's a kind of balancing act that a writer has to make to ensure that they're not offending their audience, right? That they're sporting with these ideas in ways that are fair, that are thoughtful or mindful, and that have a purpose, that serve some kind of thematic purpose. So if you're writing about this stuff, just as if you were writing about something gory, I would say don't write gore for the sake of gore. Why are you writing this? What purpose does it serve? What is the lesson that you're teaching us? How are these characters manifestations of everyday anxieties, unconscious desires, etc.? How can we connect to the madman if we're sane, and why? What are you doing that for? All right, how do we do it now? Let's get into the thick of that. You probably know this already, the concept of the unreliable narrator. In other words, a storyteller that can't be trusted because they're insane. And the classic is, of course, the narrator of Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. I brought with me the opening passages from The Telltale Heart, and I thought I could read them out loud, and we can kind of talk through, do a close reading of this. So first I want to read it for story, then I want to go back so you can understand what's happening, then I want to go back through it and analyze it along with you so that we can kind of identify how a writer represents madness. What choices are they making? What strategies are they taking by representing madness through an unreliable narrator and through the use of language? Okay. And what effect does this have on the reader? So here we go. I'll try to read it fast the first time through, but yeah, it speaks for itself. Here we go. The Telltale Heart. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of a hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it oh so gently. And then when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh so cautiously, cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And it goes on from there. Okay, what are we given by Poe here? Obviously, the narrator is not quite reliable because he's over-exaggerating how sane he is, right? It's that whole, I think you protest too much kind of concept. So right off the bat, you have to recognize that if a character is mad, they often don't believe that they're mad. Uh, in fact, to them, their madness can be rational. They can explain their motives, their thinking. There's a logic to it that isn't normative or natural. It's not based in science or Greek logic in an orthodox way. They draw conclusions from premises that are not justifiably drawn, and then those new conclusions become new premises, often by which paranoid beliefs are built. Uh, there's all sorts of things going on here. I bet you can think of others. Let's look over it again. I hope you can read it. I don't know. Let me see. Maybe I can just put it all the way up on the screen. Maybe that's a little bit better. I want to do some close reading of this. Just to look at how the language accentuates the character losing their mind. Now, granted, this is like, early, mid 1800s, I believe Poe was writing. And so the voice is a little affected, right? But imagine a character or a person speaking this way today, they would also seem insane because it doesn't jive with the historical situation. But here, let's say it does. Linguistically or mechanically, the writing itself is doing things that accentuate that send the signal, let's say, that the main character, the speaker, is off his rocker. All right. First off, notice it's in first person point of view. So we're hearing somebody's monologue, and this is why it's an unreliable narrator, because they're doing all the talking. It's all we got to follow the story. It's all we're given. So we need this person to tell us the story, but he's not to be trusted, even though you know, he says right from the get-go, why are you saying that I'm mad? You know, right away he's on the defensive. So his defensiveness of this confession, his explanation for his behavior is a big part of the context here. But notice the kind of almost there's a poetry, let's say. There's a poetry to the madness. So it's like staccato. In other words, they're very short, like jagged turns of phrases. So it's like true, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. See, there's a lot of phrases cut off with dashes. In other words, it's like their head is turning, right? They're like twitching, twitching. The language is literally twitching. And there's also repetition, right? Very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. So not, right? Very, very, not. And it goes on and on and on. It's like even the phrase, how then am I mad? Hearken, right? It's like there's that true, hearken. And that this continues throughout, especially that very, very kind of business, right? The repetition. And sometimes we have the character kind of coming to sudden, jarring realizations. So like in the second paragraph here, in the middle, he's saying that this old man that he's obsessed with is evil eye. He says he'd never wronged me. He'd never given me insult. I didn't want his gold. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes, like he had forgotten. And then he remembers, oh yes, I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this, one of his eyes. But then all he talks about is how this vulture eye, this evil eye, haunts him in the remainder of it. So if this were true, if he killed the man because his eye was so scary, why would he have forgotten it and just kind of remember, oh yeah, it was his eye. It was this. You see, so he's skipping around in time. He's forgetful of the facts. The kind of platform for his thinking is broken. You know, his foot is falling through the floorboards of that platform, if I can use that metaphor. And there's more to the poetry here, right? Like you can probably see there's a lot of alliteration and things like that that Poe likes to use. And I'm going to come back on the screen here. It's kind of a classic. Is it classic? It's a common thought that two people speak in rhymes and it echoes like this: poets and madmen. And every poet is a little off their rocker, I think, because they think this way. Language doesn't follow the chain of causality that we get in fiction. Poetry follows its own logic. It can, writers contort their own like sing-song verse in lyrical forms, so that there's patterns, just like the beat of the telltale heart at the end of the story. All right, I want to keep going here because it's already almost, oh my gosh, 50 minutes. I didn't think I'd even fill an hour. So I've got more. I want to go to some other ideas. I put these kind of like crazy characters into three categories in fiction, right? They're screamers, dreamers, and streamers. And up there's the madman rhyming right there, right? Screamers, dreamers, and streamers. Let's see what I mean by that. And they're just like archetypes of kind of madness that you can select from in your own psychological horror fiction or, craziness. Screamers are the characters that are very extremely like insane. So stark raving madmen, right? I'm not saying they should always be the main character or the speaker as in Poe's stark raving madmen, but that's a common trope of psychological horror that, can be used in any genre, of course, but, we often see stories that focus on that. Sometimes a story or a scene might focus on a nervous breakdown and the character is literally like screaming for sanity and help. They're in pain, and sometimes it's an obvious psychotic break where someone's just like not in the realm of reality whatsoever. So we have characters like that. Those are the more obvious madmen of these genres. But then we have like dreamers, and these are characters that might be experiencing a living nightmare, right? So like in a fantasy story, like in this picture, the monster under the bed. Or perhaps there's a surreal journey that, their mind, you're not quite sure if, it's all in their head or not. Sometimes we just have like characters that have an obsession, like Monk, who I mentioned before, or characters that are dramatized as having a neurotic fit of some kind. And I call them dreamers because they, the focus of the story isn't their crazy character pathology per se, but like their wish fulfillment is center stage. Like they wish for something, and the story is dramatizing them on a quest mentally to fulfill that wish, which is the logic of fantasy. All right, that's the logic of fantasy, which is a little crazy if you think about it. That's why we love it. And what do I mean by streamers? Well, these are characters that maybe aren't kind of, if I can use the word normal in the story, but have a breakage and suddenly kind of go off on a stream of consciousness or a stream of thought, like an aside or a tangent or something like that in the story. And sometimes those are like moments of breakage that are where a character is literally losing it. Okay, so you can have a paranoid episode, like this funny picture of Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Somebody who thinks they see some, secret motives, some secret society or something happening, where they get very, very paranoid and worried. Sometimes it's just a daydream. Somebody's like, oh, I wish I was with him. Oh, it would be so nice. That kind of thing. Like a lover, a daydreaming lover. Sometimes characters have depressive fits, right? They're just like unwilling to get out of bed. That's hard to write because it's not entertaining. It's kind of a downer. But, these other elements, and we often think of characters losing it, crazy characters, if you will, as being manic. But there's a flip side to that. They're not always manic. Sometimes they're depressive, and that's kind of a way to earn reader empathy for them, is to show that they're sad, ill, sick, in pain. We should, feel sorry for them, even if they are doing dastardly things. Sometimes people can't lose their ability to communicate, like maybe Tourette's, as I gave the example before, or somebody just loses their, like maybe they're very, very, very old, right? They're getting Alzheimer's, something like that. Or just a panic attack, which is a pretty common thing, dramatized in fiction. I think it's good to have panic attacks in your fiction where characters freak out a little bit, where they kind of lose control of things and wonder about their own ability to keep it together. I think it's normal and human. And, a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about is absurd and extreme, but all of these things are fragments of the real world for us as readers. So I think it's good it makes your character well-rounded if you show them not always perfectly sane and proper, right? So maybe they should panic a little bit once in a while, especially if they're about to lose something. Maybe not necessarily their mind, maybe a loved one, control of a situation, if it's related to their occupation, something like that. Losing control. All right, I have another paragraph I wanted us to analyze, and this is actually from a student in one of my flash fiction classes. I got their permission to share it. It's untitled. I'm going to read it out loud, and I want you to think about how this writer is representing a character who might be exhibiting madness, might be losing it, that kind of thing, or maybe they've lost it altogether, okay? The trick here is that it's not necessarily about an unreliable narrator. It's written in it's written in first person, but the mad or insane character is not the speaker, as far as we know. Let's see. All right, I'll read it out loud so we can all get through it at the same time, but I want you to think to yourself about how you would deconstruct the topics we've been talking about in this story. I'm sorry for the small font. I'll blow it up again. He warns me about his mother's Alzheimer's at dinner, about how every day she still follows the routine she's had for years, including the part where she goes to the kitchen with cotton balls and rubbing alcohol to clean his father's wounds before she starts dinner. He tells how his father worked for the commission as a field agent and spent his days cutting through the sharp underbrush looking for fallen stars. How he came home each day covered in cuts from thorns and waited patiently for his wife to clean them. He shows me a picture of his father. They look just like each other. Shows me the pamphlet from the funeral. A heart attack, apparently. We finish our spaghetti and get in the cab to his mother's house. When we walk in, she smiles and scurries away. I look at him questioningly and he rolls his eyes. She thinks I'm him. Old habits die hard. I usually just let her do it. She comes shuffling back into the kitchen with a handful of cotton balls and a bottle of rubbing alcohol. He perches on the counter and waits for her to start cleaning him. You know, you can't quite clean his wounds if he hasn't got any, I say as I smiled at her, hoping she'd realize her mistake. She slowly turned to look at me and nodded. She put the cotton balls down and picked up the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables for dinner. Then we'll make some. The end. Okay, this is a rough draft from an undergraduate student in my flash fiction class this semester. I thought this was a clever story. The writer, excuse me, my cat says, hi, hey, that's Hex. He always makes an appearance. Um, this had no real prompt or anything. She just wrote a story. It had to be 250 words, I think, and this is what she turned in. I thought it was very clever because it dealt with kind of this strange pathology of an Alzheimer's patient or victim. Um, the mother who continues to clean her husband's wounds from this strange job. I'm not sure about this whole stars in the underbrush thing, but that might have just been the story she told her son. However, it's that compulsion to repeat the act, to keep cleaning the wounds, right? The refusal to accept the death of her husband or the boy's father. Um, Now, Alzheimer's is a particular disease of the mind, right? Where we forget. We forget things. It's not extreme insanity that drives you to commit murder or anything like that. And the boy, the son, is complicit in this by playing the role of his own father and just like because he looks like him and letting her tend to his wounds that he doesn't have because he's given up like trying to say, no, mom, I'm not him, I'm not dad, he passed away. He just kind of like lets her do it, probably as an act of love, believing that this allows her to, continue to be herself and to hold on to what she knows. But the narrator is an outsider observing all this. And that's interesting because I think, quite often in fiction, you have to have the outsider who kind of is the validator of reality, the person who sees the craziness and stands for the reader, so to speak, who might be incredulous about what's happening, not believing, this isn't what people do, this isn't the right way to act. And so they sort of tell us as readers how we're supposed to be interpreting this action, this behavior. Remember, losing it, madness, and psychological issues, they're behaviors, right? They're not just a person. It's not who they are. Uh, People are human. They're still three-dimensional, even if they act two-dimensional. And as writers, we want to respect the three-dimensionality of it, not succumb to the easiness of representing somebody who's off their rocker as being inhuman and flattening them to two-dimensional, like their behavior defines them. Now, granted, in serial killer fiction, a lot of horror fiction just about madmen, right? Those characters are relatively two-dimensional, you know. That's the problem. They represent two-dimensional thinking. Uh, but sometimes the creativity of the writer, the absurdity of their behavior, the extremes that they go to, kind of makes up for the fact that they're acting in inhuman two-dimensional ways. But in this case, we get a very human story, I think, until the end. Now, you probably heard it and thought, what? At the end, the boy who's observing this challenges the woman with Alzheimer's and says, you know, you're not going to clean his wounds if he doesn't have any. And then she turns it around on him and makes this like logical conclusion and says, okay, then we'll make some wounds. Like she needs that much. Now, that ending only makes sense if the mother does not have Alzheimer's, but something else. And the boy who believed, the son who believed that she had Alzheimer's, was wrong. But then why would he be sitting there and habitually letting her do this, right? So the habituality of it, the fact that she's always cleaning his wounds, says to me that she does have Alzheimer's, and this whole thing that she's a serial killer or something like that she's a murderer who could kill her own son, let alone her husband, if that's who he is in her mind. That doesn't make sense, and it's irrational to the point where it's the story logic is irrational. You understand what I'm saying? So the writer, I asked them to revise this. They have, you know, right now they're revising it somewhere. This is very recent. But you know, I told them my critique of the story was the ending and how that was an unfair turn of the tables, so to speak. I like a good twist ending, but it's got to be, you know, it's got to be earned. So maybe the writer will make it so that she is not necessarily Alzheimer's, but something else. But right now, it doesn't feel right. And I wanted to share this with you because it illustrates the very problem that I was talking about throughout, really. And that is the difficulty of writing about madness or mental illness at all without making it demonic or demonizing it. So in a way, okay, this story treats people with Alzheimer's as the equivalent of psychotic killers. Right? Like they need to be put away, imprisoned, or else they might commit these kind of acts. Or that someone with Alzheimer's is so dangerous that they would go to such an extreme just to make themselves remember, you know, their husband or something like that. They would kill their son. That is not true to the illness of Alzheimer's, and it's an example of demonizing mental illness, right? To treat people who have illnesses as the equivalent of mad killers. In other words, this mother figure in the story is a moral person until that end, and then they become vastly immoral, and it doesn't seem logically earned. It seems like the writer is suggesting that just because they have a mental difficulty, therefore they are two-dimensional, dangerous people that should be put away. You see the problem? So this is why you really want to respect mental illness, and the only way you can do that in your fiction is to know a lot about it, to do your research. All right? I'm going to wrap up with some ideas for activities in a second here, but I wanted to talk through that with you. Hopefully you can read the text and you can think about it further if you like. But food for thought, stuff to keep in mind. You want to make sure you're not guilty of making a similar kind of faux pas. It can be earned, that kind of ending, but it's not quite there yet. All right, so some exercises you might try on your own. These are just very general ones. I just thought I'd come up with a couple for you. Obviously, you can do whatever you like, but use some of the tactics that we've been talking about. Play with them. Try to write anything in the voice of Edgar Allan Poe's narrator from The Telltale Heart, right? Just a character that's obsessed with anything. Try to write it in that voice and see what happens. I think you'll have fun with it. Let's see what I got here. True, true. Very good that coffee is. All right, so here's one. Give a hero a concussion that makes him temporarily villainous. And by hero, I don't mean superhero like the Avengers. I mean, anybody who's like an upstanding, virtuous character, a protagonist that's likable. You might want to avoid the overt stereotypical heroes like, I don't know, a pastor or a fireman or something like that, a cop. But maybe somebody who's supposed to have it together. Come up with a scenario where they're given a concussion beyond their control and they start acting villainous in a way that threatens other people. I think that would be an interesting story. So that's just a prompt for you to play with, right? Because all good fiction hinges on change and dramatizing change and to show the kind of switch of somebody's moral center so vastly switched, like a light switch, just turns them from good to bad, just like that, due to a concussion or something similar. All right? See what you can do there. That's just one prompt of many. Here's another example. Maybe you could write the stream of consciousness of an intellectual character, like a professor type, losing the ability to use language. And I'm going to confess to you that this prompt really is inspired by Lovecraft, who we didn't really get to talk about today, but he often has intellectual characters, scientists, researchers, archaeologists, whatever, who kind of find some dark secret about the universe, the Cthulhu world, that there are creatures in the universe that don't care about mankind and want to kill us or just don't even care and will kill us. And it breaks our brains, or it breaks the brains of characters when they find this out, like when they read some archaic book that was written by these elder gods or whatever. It's so vastly insane that it's beyond human comprehension, So anyway, in Lovecraftian stories, characters often lose, the ability to speak, and they start using this funny language, like, and he literally will write gobbledygook on the page. Cthulhu Fatang, that kind of stuff. It sounds like an alien tongue, but that's kind of cool. That's what makes it cool. It's like Klingon in Star Trek or something. But it's about, these stories are really about the breakdown of language, how, the structures of reality that, language is a symbolic system that structures our reality. We think in words and therefore tell ourselves we're sane if we can put a sentence together, right, and explain things. But that isn't necessarily how the brain operates. We're not always thinking in terms of symbols and language, complete sentences and whatnot. So what if you were to dramatize somebody losing their mind, literally, through language? What would that be like? And I'll give you another short, maybe not Lovecraft, maybe a short story by Stephen King, pretty short, called Survivor Type. One of the darkest horror stories ever written. Read that and analyze how he uses language in that story, how a character who's alone on a desert island, stranded, is starving to death. I'm not going to spoil the story, but he's starving to death, and he's starting to lose his marbles. And that comes across in his stream of consciousness, in the first person point of view. The language itself starts to break down. Words stop making as much sense. He's keeping a journal or a diary, but those words just, it's scary the way that they're not making sense anymore. Anyway, that's inspiration for you. See if you could write something like that. And this last one might be a little more normal, might be a little less genre-oriented, but imagine 4 people in an elevator. Not necessarily trapped, maybe it's a long elevator ride to the top of a skyscraper or something. But one of the 4 people keeps muttering incoherently. Again, breakdown of language. And another character in the elevator is terribly bothered by this. It's making them anxious that this other person is just spouting nonsense and talking to themselves. Dramatize that and see what happens on the way to the top. I'm not going to say anything more about that. I bet you can come up with something interesting and fun. And if you want more prompts that are perhaps more twisted than these, look for my book, Instigation, Creative Prompts on the Dark Side. Yes, I'm plugging my own work at the end of this. It's an e-book. I don't remember how much it is, $3. It has lots of story premises, prompts, scenarios, and essays and things like that that you might get a charge of. Thank you, everybody, for coming to my class on losing it. We went a little over time. Sorry about that. I guess I lost control of my mind. Feel free to email me any feedback you might have if you made it this far through the class. I'd love to see anything you write inspired by those prompts or just to hear it from you. My email at Seton Hill is, as you can probably guess, Arnzen, A-R-N-Z-E-N, @setonhill.edu. Have a good time at the In Your Right Mind conference, folks. I wish I could be there live with you. I will be busy with residency, but I look forward to seeing some of you on campus again after this crazy pandemic. Thanks, folks. Enjoy.